Okay, so our guests today are Professor Martin Ricketts and Professor Terance Kealey. Our discussant is Jan Zygmuntowski. Professor Martin Ricketts is Professor of Economic Organization at the University of Buckingham, Dean of the School of Business and Dean of Humanities at the University of Buckingham until 2014, now Managing Trustee of the Institute of Economic Affairs and is Chairman of its International Advisory Council. He has published in professional journals on the theory of firm, aspects of public finance, the new institutional economics and housing policy. He has also a number of numerous books, including The Economics of Business Enterprise, which has already had 4 editions. Professor Terance Kealey is Professor of Clinical Biochemistry at the University of Buckingham, Vice Chancellor of the University of Buckingham until 2014, Research Fellow at the Cato Institute, author of original papers, scientific reviews, author of 3 books, recognized as vital contribution to the study of science and public policy, where he is arguing that science is not a public good, but rather organized within invisible colleges, and so government funding is irrelevant. And their latest publications, among many, many others, of course, but the latest one during the last few months is the Crowding In and Crowding Out Within a Contribution Good Model of Research, published in Research Policy in 2022. And also a chapter in the monograph Governing Markets as Knowledge Commons. And the chapter is titled The Contribution Good as the Foundation of the Industrial Revolution, and published in Cambridge University Press at the end of 2021. So both professors are closely related to University of Buckingham. University, the oldest private university in the United Kingdom, founded in the 70s, and now is non-profit private university in England. One of the 5 private universities in the UK, as I'm not wrong. And our discussant is Jan Zygmuntowski, Polish economist interested in politics of new technologies and digital economy, lecturer at Koźmińskiego University in the field of management and AI in digital society, co-president of Polish Economy Network. He gained his experience also at Polish Development Fund, and he's a scholarship holder of G20 Global Solution, British Council, and Muller Institute. He's also author of the book Network Capitalism, Kapitalizm w sieci. Okay, and now I think it's time to give the floor to Professor Martin Ricketts. Professor Ricketts, the floor is yours.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Renata. I think, this is obviously a very much a joint session between myself and Terance. From your introduction, people will have gathered that we work together in sort of non-academic ways, in administrative ways. That is always academic, I suppose, in the sense that we were at the University of Buckingham together, but our academic work has sort of come out of that connection, if you like. He is a biochemist, I'm an economist, so I suppose it's my fault if the economics is completely wrong. But on the other hand, my sort of involvement in this area is stimulated really by Terance's work, which very much predated the work that we've done together. Anyway, we're collaborating today, and I know he wanted to leave plenty of time for discussion and so forth, and so I'm going to be handing over to him quite soon. But since the center of this sort of seminar is about this concept of the contribution good and the possible sort of implications of regarding science as a contribution good, I thought a few slides on that just to begin with would help set the scene. So maybe we could have the first, we move on to the first slide. And here you'll see the essential sort of initial taxonomy, if you like, that with which everyone will be very, very familiar, I'm sure. In most of the public finance textbooks, certainly those that I read as a student, I mean, science was the sort of classic example of a public good. Well, I suppose second only to the lighthouse. The lighthouse was given the great example of a public good in Samuelson and so forth. But the whole economics of information literature was sort of based upon this problem, if you like, of information being non-excludable and non-rival. And I've just got the familiar kind of axes there, the vertical axis concerning the degree of rivalry that we have, and along the horizontal axis, the degree of excludability, and of course, the pure public good being in the lower left-hand corner, non-rival and non-excludable. And on the whole, science was seen as very much part of that pure public good element. This really goes back to the 1950s and the classic paper that I've just cited at the top by Kenneth Arrow. But of course, the problem with that public good, pure public good model is it seemed to prove too much, really. You had the problem really of understanding how any serious sort of basic science was ever undertaken. I mean, historically, as I put it here, a substantial amount of scientific research was undertaken. I mean, it's a bit like, I suppose, the case of the lighthouse. You have the relatively well-known, I think, I don't know quite how familiar people are in Poland with Ronald Coase's work and so on. I mean, a famous example of the lighthouse in which he showed that far from being publicly financed, they were actually hit from a historical point of view, mainly privately financed in the UK in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this is an interesting thing. When you look at the historical record, you find that the pure economic analysis is really a bit misleading. One gets sort of carried away with the purity of the theory, and one makes a lot of assumptions that aren't necessarily correct about the consequences. So the pure public goods model obviously therefore runs into this problem of really the historical record. Maybe we could have the next slide, because the question then is, well, how do we explain the development that occurred? You would expect in a public good framework, the free rider problem would dominate, and nothing would ever get done. This is where the contribution good really comes in. There are, as was mentioned on the previous slide, and I didn't talk about in detail, the way obviously economics is developed is to consider science really now as a sort of partial public good, if you like, but anyway, not at the purest end of the spectrum. So, okay, how is exclusion managed and so forth? Well, the particular view of it that Terance and I have developed is the contribution good notion. And I've tried to give a one-sentence definition of it here. A contribution good is a communal resource that yields benefits only to those who have made a contribution in kind to its development. I mean, obviously, you can have communal resources in the sense which you have to you have to pay to access or something. But in this case, we're considering a contribution, we're saying in kind. That is, if you really want to get any benefit out of a pool of scientific knowledge, it's hard to do so, we're arguing, if you haven't in a sense contributed to it. That the idea that somehow or other one can pretty costlessly gain from a pool of knowledge to which one hasn't contributed is actually not very realistic, where the more you consider the actual circumstances of the development of knowledge. So a contribution good then is not excludable in the conventional sense. I mean, the conventional sense is that one person can deny access to a resource by another. You put a barrier up or something and charge people to go to a football match. So we're not assuming that there's a physical barrier in any sense, but one scientist couldn't in practice prevent another scientist from using a particular piece of science, other than by secrecy, of course, and so forth. But we're going to say that there's absolutely no advantage to that in the end of secrecy, or that the advantages are very much exaggerated. So we argue instead that any scientist is only in a position to use a piece of science if he or she has contributed to the pool of science and has thus implicitly added something potentially beneficial to others. It's a contribution good in that sense. If I want to make use of these communal resources, actually I find they're useless to me unless I get involved. Once I get involved, I'm making a contribution. And that might be quite beneficial to others, of course. So there's a sort of dynamic which leads to mutual contribution. There's a sort of connection with the economics of social clubs, where the sort of, the social ethos is what is primarily consumed. Although I shouldn't, that analogy probably isn't as strong as it might be. I mean, social clubs can be very exclusive, can't they? I mean, to some extent, that's the whole purpose, perhaps. So exclusion comes in much more with the social club and restricting membership, whereas, as we'll see, that doesn't apply to our sort of approach to the contribution good. Another more philosophical point is this tacit knowledge point, that really what we're relying on in this approach is the sort of philosophical tradition of the importance of tacit knowledge. Goes back to Polanyi in the early 1960s, the tacit dimension. That is that an awful lot of knowledge isn't really codified, and you can't really fully understand knowledge simply through codified sources. That you can be trained as you like, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can understand fully what's going on, because a lot of what's going on, a lot of knowledge that you need is actually knowledge that you pick up intuitively, maybe, but through contact with others, through the tacit dimension, if you like. That we know more than we can tell, he says. You kind of have knowledge which is very difficult to communicate. The Austrian economists have made a lot of this, I think, over the years generally, in their approach to information. But anyway, that I think we rely on that notion in really developing this idea of the contribution good. Finally, I've got this reference to Marshall on this slide, in which I simply, I mean, this has an interest for me. I don't know, perhaps for many of the people attending today, but it's really just a reworking of Alfred Marshall's sort of late 19th century, early 20th century analysis of what he called real external economies. He was interested in the development of industries, and in his case, I suppose, mainly declining supply price, that over time prices would drift downwards as knowledge accumulated, as new institutions developed. He had a sort of evolutionary view of economic development, which was hard actually to reconcile with his sort of neoclassical, mathematical equilibrium, partial equilibrium tools that he was developing. But nevertheless, the rhetoric around it was very evolutionary, actually. And he talked about these external economies, real external economies. these marginal improvements, the information which would seep through an industry and result over time in declining supply price. I won't go into detail there. I mean, that's a for me an interesting sort of historical analogy, but it seems to me that what I suppose I'm saying is this whole area goes to the heart of some of the problems that neoclassical economics has faced over the years in explaining progress, explaining rather than equilibrium states, actually explaining how progress comes about. And Marshall wrestled with this, and in a way what we're doing is applying his notion of these external economies, but to an area which he would have regarded as being not really appropriate. He always excluded what he called substantive real invention as part of this system of external economies, whereas we're saying, well, why exclude it in a way, I think. Anyway, perhaps we should move on. I'm sorry, otherwise I would take far too much time. This is just well, an informal but formal explanation of what's going on, just contrasting the public good with the contribution good approach, just using the usual sort of game theoretic structure that we're used to in textbooks when explaining public goods and so forth. I've got here, two potential contributors, call them scientists if you like, A and B, and they can contribute, which is a strategy which is contributing one, or not, in which case your contribution is zero. And of course, if neither contribute, SA is zero and SB is zero, then the payoffs are zero, of course. If they both contribute, SA is one and SB is one, then the payoffs, since the pool, if you like, is two in total, A contributes one, B contributes one, the pool is two, and they both get the benefit from those 2 units of contribution as some function of those 2 units, H2, but each has had to make some kind of cost, has faced some kind of cost in order to make that contribution. So you get the payoffs for each player, H2 minus C. And so there's fairly standard. The question is what happens, of course, if one person doesn't contribute and the other person does. And here, if let's say that A contributes, then of course, and B doesn't, then the payoff to A is H1, his own contribution, minus C. This person's on their own, and that's their payoff. Therefore, whatever the payoff to 1 is, H1 minus C, which we're assuming, that traditionally is negative. So unfortunately, that will be negative, that person. But how about B? In the classic public goods model, of course, B can contribute from I beg your pardon, may benefit from A's contribution and gets a payoff of H1. But we put a theta in front of it to represent the degree of publicness, so that theta could be anywhere between 0 and 1. If it's 1, then you've got a public good problem. And you've got the standard result then in a sort of symmetrical format like this, where both scientists are assumed to be the same and so forth, that free riding becomes a dominant strategy. And that's always been the sort of problem, of course. But if theta moves down towards 0, then of course, you've got a situation where the person cannot free ride. And you get the structure becomes more like a game of pure coordination, really. Just put theta equal to 0, and you have a game of pure coordination. That is that if one of the scientists contributes, the best thing for the other scientists to do is also contribute. So, I mean, there's no question of trying to free ride on the other person, but let's get on with it then. Let's get to H2 minus C for each of us. So you have this two potential equilibria in this simple game, but both either don't contribute, in which case that would be stable. There would be no incentive for the other person to change their strategy, but equally they could both contribute, and that too would be stable. There wouldn't be as in the public good game, an incentive to someone then to go and start trying to free ride, because of the tacit nature of this and so forth. They would have no incentive to do so. They just want really reassurance that there's enough people contributing, and then everyone will want to contribute. So that's the sort of the structure, if you like. Okay, maybe we should move on very quickly now. This really is just a diagram really taken from, well, I mean, versions of it appear in both the research policy papers that Terance and I have written on the contribution good. Essentially, what's happening here is that the horizontal axis, well, there's a population of scientists of varying and researchers of varying ability assumed to exist. The human capital that we're measuring here along the horizontal axis is seen as some summation of their abilities, if you like, and the ability range is sort of between 0 and some top amount of ability, a hat, if you like, and the total amount of human capital employed, therefore, is measured along the horizontal axis in terms of summing the abilities of all the scientists who are actually contributing at the moment. Therefore, it's the integral, if you like, it's a definite integral between the scientist of minimum ability that's actually, or the smallest ability actually operating at the moment, to the most able. So as we move along the horizontal axis, the pool of science, if you like, the human capital employed in total increases, and it does so as more and more scientists become engaged. And we're moving, though, interestingly, down the ability range. We're saying, well, the most able will be the ones that will find it in their interest to contribute first, and then actually we move on to lower ability scientists as you move along that horizontal axis. But what's on the vertical axis? What are we measuring here? Well, actually, what we've got here is a measure of what we call the rent, if you like, or profit, that is available from contributing by the marginal scientist at that point. So, in other words, on the left-hand side, you see that even at very low, where there are very, very few scientists engaged at all, we obviously find that that losses are made, and that the payoff is negative. As we move on, and we can imagine somehow enticing more scientists to become involved, you get to a point where even the scientist of the minimum ability of those at present, involved, begins to be able to use this pool of science profitably. And that's at the critical, what we call the critical mass. This is achieved when this marginal ability scientist earns zero profit, if you like. We're assuming that, as I say, this pool of science is capable of delivering profit, although the amount that it will deliver will depend on the ability of the scientist. Hence, the profit is this function, A times HS minus C. This is just a way of organizing our thoughts about, about the forces involved. It's not supposed to be highly realistic, as you can see, but it's a way of trying to think about what might be going on. Then when we get above this critical mass, then everyone is interested in contributing. Even lower ability scientists can come on board, and you do get this sort of takeoff, as you would in any kind of agglomeration economies type analysis. You get a point at which the system tends to grow, and you attract, rather like a geographical area will attract businesses to a particular place in the classical sort of location arguments. You get that growth, but eventually, because the frequency distribution of ability is such that eventually the ability level of scientists is perhaps declining. You get to a point where this expansion stops, and that's the equilibrium. It's still in principle, if we're thinking neoclassical terms, it's still, you could argue, inefficient, that it could be a bit bigger, but that's really not the thing that we're focusing on. Obviously, we're trying to explain, how research and really how economic growth really got stimulated in the first place and eventually took off. I've labeled the part at the very left of the diagram that where losses are made. This is the sort of pre-takeoff problem, if you like. How do you get to the critical mass? This could be done in various ways, and I think that Terance is going to talk about that. But you could call it, if you like, a sort of visible college. Whereas in the post-takeoff phase, then one can think perhaps more metaphorically in terms of a sort of invisible college. Terance will tell us, I've forgotten now who invented the term the invisible college, but it escapes me for the time being. Anyway, that's the essential argument. Okay, can we move on to the final slide? Just a few final thoughts before I hand over to Terance. So what we got, the public good paradigm, we're saying, really, as well, even neoclassical endogenous growth theorists have understood, it's hardly suitable for analyzing the growth of scientific knowledge, really. We have to have something more than that, and indeed there has been over many years. New knowledge then is partially excludable, but not just in the endogenous growth theory way of saying, well, we've got patents for designs and applied results, and if we have enough time lags, we can generate growth that way. What we're doing is putting, I think, extra pressure on the tacit knowledge argument, and of course the difference that makes is that it makes openness to some extent an outcome of self-interested behavior. Within the endogenous growth theory tradition, you still have this obsession with trying to keep people from free riding, really, you can do that with patents, and then insist then that the results are open to everyone to look at. But there isn't that much emphasis on the idea that all that information won't be much good unless people are cooperating together. And there are commercial forces leading to a certain amount of openness. I mean, people like recently talking about the common, the innovation commons. Have emphasized this very, very much. What I've therefore said in the third part here is that the requirements for achieving critical mass are what's more important, really, than the creation of exclusion mechanisms and so forth. As I say, what we're interested in is not preventing free riding so much as trying to get enough, critical mass to give personal incentives to become involved in a particular scientific area, or more generally, if one can use this kind of theory for particular areas, but can also use it to explain bigger historical developments. Anyway, the point is that it's not exclusion that becomes so important as getting to a critical mass of collaborators. Okay, and so I think I'll hand over to Terance at this point, because I'm not sure, but I think he's going to talk about the Industrial Revolution, which I mentioned at the bottom there as being one of the great interests, if you like, that comes, one of the great things that one inevitably begins to reinterpret when you take this contribution good approach. So over to you, Terance.
Professor Terance?
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you.
So I'm really thrilled to be talking to a Polish audience, because I think the most important person in the history of this field is a Pole, Ludwig Fleck, who I don't think is remembered enough for what his great achievement was. It was Ludwig Fleck who in 1935 wrote the book that has been translated into English as Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact. And Ludwig Fleck was the man who initiated the modern sociology of science. If you look at people like Thomas Kuhn or Polanyi, everyone who understands science has learnt from Fleck what science is. And Fleck, of course, like myself, was a clinical pathologist. He was actually incarcerated just around the corner from where you are at Auschwitz. He was Jewish and at other concentration camps. But he was such a remarkably competent clinical pathologist that the Nazis did not murder him, because he was more useful to them in keeping epidemics at bay in these concentration camps. So he was more useful to the Nazis alive than dead. So he survived the war and went on to lead a distinguished post-war career in Poland. But his great contribution was pointing out that non-scientists do not understand how scientists work. And this is where the contribution that Martin and I have made, I think, is important, because since Fleck wrote in 1935, which is nearly 100 years ago, there's been a very rich elaboration of the history and philosophy of science. And most philosophers of science and most sociologists of science agree. So the sociologists and economists of science agree what science is. But completely separate from this has been the economist tradition. And the economists, with the exception of Professor Martin Ricketts, have chosen to adopt a model of science which is a fiction. And so this is elaborated. In fact, I can see it at the back of Martin's head as I look at him in the picture. There's a terrible book in the back called Endogenous Growth Theory, written by Aghion and another author. And this is a terrible book because it's fiction from page 1 to the last page. And what the economists have said, knowing nothing about science and choosing not to know anything about science, is that science is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. And here I'm building on what Martin has said. Now, of course, knowledge is non-rivalrous. If I use the third law of thermodynamics and Martin uses the third law of dynamics, the third law is not diminished and we are not diminished. I, as a scientist, will probably use it better than Martin, but that's a separate point. But the economists also claim, and I'm just repeating what Martin has said, but I'm doing it from a historical perspective, that science is non-excludable. And if you look at Romer, the classic Romer paper, he got a Nobel Prize for this paper, which is, of course, the basis of endogenous growth theory. What Romer says is that science is not excludable either. So if I come up with a new scientific principle and I'm in the world of industry, then all my competitors will steal my ideas, and actually they'll make more money than I will because they don't have to bear the costs of developing the idea. They can just copy cost-free and put me out of business. So no one will ever develop research in the market. The trouble with this is that this is a completely ahistorical view. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, which took place in Britain, and by the way, it took place in Britain not because the British are genetically superior than everyone else. This is not a talk about Brexit, I can assure you. The Industrial Revolution took place in Britain because the first Industrial Revolution took place in Italy in Renaissance times, but the Italians then got invaded by various people. The next Industrial Revolution took place in the Netherlands before the British Industrial Revolution, but they got invaded by various people. So we in Britain were only the third people to have an Industrial Revolution, but very fortunately for us, we had the English Channel, and so we weren't invaded. So we finally got on with the Industrial Revolution. And the thing about the Industrial Revolution that took place in Britain, which was absolutely laissez-faire, if there was a definition of a night watchman state, it was Britain during the Industrial Revolution. The state did absolutely nothing. Taxes were barely existing. The state employed a few soldiers and sailors to keep foreigners away, a few policemen to beat up criminals, lots and lots of hangmen, because the British are a bloodthirsty race and liked hanging people. But other than that, the British state did nothing. The rule of law, night watchman state, and that was it. And yet that was the country that created the Industrial Revolution. So transparently, it's simply a myth that governments need to fund research, because the Industrial Revolution, and if you look at rates of economic growth in Britain, they just seem endlessly on to modern rates of economic growth, took place without the government funding of science. America is the dramatic example. The United States of America, to be brief, the American government did not fund science for its own sake in America till 1950, and indeed didn't fund science at all, basically, until 1940. And the science you see between 1940 and 1950 in America is all about defense. Only in 1950 does the American government convert to the idea that there's market failure in science. But between 1776, when the Americans became independent, and sadly, but there we are, between 1776 when the Americans became independent and the Second World War, they were as laissez-faire in science as the British. And the country that overtook Britain as the world's leading industrial power was America, laissez-faire in research. So whoever says that governments need to fund science is simply wrong. And the economists say this because they haven't looked at the history. This is exactly as Martin Ricketts has said. What we have done, Martin and I, is we have looked at the history. And our science, our economics, has come out of the history. Now, I'm not an economist, and Martin is not a historian of science. And so the tragedy has been, I hate to use a cliche, but the tragedy has been in this field of silo thinking. There have been the economists who for nearly 100 years have created a fictitious image of science as non-excludable and non-rivalrous. And there have been the sociologists and the philosophers who, following the example of Ludwig Fleck, have said, look, science is a collective communal activity. And what Martin and I have done is we brought these two strands of scholarship together. That is what we have done. We have tried to apply economic tools to the actual history, sociology, and philosophy of science. And the point is, exactly as Martin said, is knowledge is tacit. It's a nonsense to say that science is not excludable. How many people listening to me now, I think, how many of you here listening to could clone a gene? How many of you could build an iPhone? How many of you could read a paper in plasma physics? Even if any of you could do one of those, and as it happens, I can do one of those. I can clone a gene, but I can't do the other two. If any of you could do any of those, you certainly won't be able to do the other two. So the only people who can read a scientific paper or a patent or can reverse engineer a competitor's product is someone who is themselves, as Martin says, contributed to that knowledge. Only molecular biologists can read papers in molecular biology, and you become a molecular biologist by contributing. So only when you're contributing, you actually produce knowledge that's of value that you can then understand the research of others. So we have redefined economics, economics of science, Martin and I, simply by looking at the work of Ludwig Fleck and all his successors to say, well, what would the economics of something that was tacit look like? And it would be, in fact, very excludable, but of course, non-rivalrous. And we're not dealing, incidentally, a very important point, We're not dealing here with neoclassical economics, as Martin has absolutely adumbrated. We're not dealing here with an infinite number of producers, an infinite number of suppliers, and perfect knowledge. Under those circumstances, you may get equilibria, but you don't get R&D, you don't get growth by definition, because the moment a company does R&D, you're no longer dealing in the perfect market. The real world is a very imperfect world of actually classical competition. That produces R&D. And that's a very different economics than the economics of Ken Arrow or Richard Nelson or Paul Romer. And even though Paul Romer in endogenous growth theory does in fact model what I should call classical economics, in that companies are competing with each other, what Romer still persists in is treating science as this non-excludable good. And therefore, he can only get what he calls economic growth through the use of patents. And we know that that's not true, because there is absolutely no evidence that patents have any benefits at all in aggregate to an economy. They may benefit one person at the expense of other people, but look, in aggregate, patents have no benefit at all, contrary to all the myths that we're brought up on. So to conclude, the sociology of science is completely different from what economists say it is. It's a very collective activity. It's collective because you can't actually access the research of others unless you become one of them, unless you're contributing science. And also it's collective because the best way of accessing the research of others is to meet them and literally share research. And in the paper Martin and I wrote on the Industrial Revolution, we get lots of examples from Alan and others pointing out the extraordinary lengths to which companies share knowledge with each other, completely different from the myths that exist. And of course, academic science, like academic economics, is all about academics writing papers, going to conferences and sharing knowledge. That's what dealers in knowledge do. They share knowledge because that's the only way to grow. And so what we have done is we have simply applied from his discipline, the discipline of economics, to my discipline, the economics of research, and put them together to create something that's bigger than either of us could have done alone, to say the economics of science is very different from what economists say. This is what it is. And the huge implication is that governments do not have to fund science. And that has enormous implications for the way the world works, nor need governments supply patents. With the exception of pharmaceuticals, which is an exception I'm not going to get into now because of regulatory costs. But the whole concept of patents is based on the similar misconception of what research is like. And at that point, I'm going to stop because, as Martin says, I find, and he finds, that it's the discussion element of these talks that is so much more valuable than Martin and I pontificating. So I shall stop now and go for questions.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Kealey. And now Jan Zygmuntowski.
Right, thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation. I will proceed with a brief comment on the paper and its findings, its contribution, how I see it from the perspective of economics. So a lot to blame on our discipline, that's for sure. But definitely from the perspective of heterodox economics, it will not be the typical point of view. And then I will try to present an alternative model, which I think can also point to maybe future research in this field. Okay, let me share the screen. Right, I hope you can see it now. Right, so the brief comment. First of all, I think the paper has some really strong sides to it. The moving on from pure public good approach is definitely a powerful contribution. A lot of other types of goods were modeled or seen as public goods, like, let's say, clean air, right? The typical public good that anybody can access. You cannot exclude anyone from breathing. Well, with the new findings of climate sciences, we know now very well that also, and also, you know, the toxicity. So the health practitioners, we know that air also is not a pure public good, and probably in the end we will move from, in general, this pure public good approach and find different types of goods in different fields and disciplines. I really like how this paper builds these micro foundations for scholarly knowledge production. So instead of assuming knowledge just falls from the sky, it shows how we could model the incentives and how this dynamics of invisible college are created, how they emerge. One thing is its formation. So I think this is very important in also for studies like how scientific disciplines or how schools in for example economics form. It seems to be very similar to this invisible college, as in, you know, some researchers begin in the field, they have some reputation, they kind of share this reputation with newcomers, so this invisible college emerges, and there's some dynamics of this evolution. And for sure the rationale here for bridging technologies, transfer, research collaborations, the rationale for this kind of public intervention is very strong. Now, in terms of weaknesses, I think first of all, the biggest weakness would be that we see science as homogeneous good, right? So it's all about it's science as one thing, but rewards to science, which in the paper are assumed as markets, so capitalist rents and profits, would not be the same for different types of science, right? So basic research versus applied research, social sciences against like the true sciences, the applied ones like biopharmacy or whatever, critical theory, which also would be difficult to commercialize, or even it may have a lower payout, right? So incentives to move from this discipline, or have even zero payouts, or even potentially destroy somebody's career. And it doesn't really, it's not restrained to, only purely critical scientists. We have this in my field, which is digital economics. We have this recent case of well-known researcher Timnit Gebru being fired from Google for criticizing some of Google's modeling approaches in AI. So we can see that even someone who is a very strong scientist veering into critical approaches already may have even negative payouts in terms of destroying of career. Also, if science is not homogeneous but heterogeneous good, and also one thing is the college formation and another is the college direction, right? So the choice of problems to study emerges based on the market, so capitalist incentives. Already Richard Nelson, for example, in his really important work, The Ghetto and the Moon, showed why, for example, the sciences of rocket research and going to the moon were so well funded, whereas research in solving the problems of the ghetto, they didn't capture that much attention. A similar problem we could see related to COVID-19 pandemic, with the mRNA studies being funded mostly by public research up until now. So basically the pandemic, where suddenly commercial interest in this relatively new field has emerged. We wouldn't have vaccines so fast without public funding. This is a fact that we should establish here. Public funding was absolutely necessary. Now, a strong assumption that I'm not sure, and I would love to hear your more of your points on this, is whether the science is exclusive, as in, can we tell someone that, can we somehow see non-contributors as also as people who don't benefit from it? We can see that in the dynamic of US and China, for example, that even though Chinese industry was mostly, sub-manufacturing things, they could also steal some patents and technologies and develop their own innovative science. So it seems that some transfer is possible, not only by contributing to technology, but in the entire value chain, which has, science, technology, manufacturing, education. It's a long chain, and you can contribute or be a part of this chain in some other piece. Now, I see also that the capacity and willingness of scientists to commercialize here is assumed, right? So it's a kind of like a two pieces model. One is science, the other is commercial actors, and then if we commercialize, we get the funding again for the first scholarly studies. Now, there are also a lot of other motivations in science, like curiosity, ideology, social reputation, societal or class interests, right? And we could even say that a lot of scientists go into science precisely to avoid being in the commercial space, so not to become entrepreneurs as a way of career development. So maybe this could be also, brought into the model and treated as some kind of endogenous incentives. I also could see this kind of homo economicus fallacy of showing that communalism is buttressed by self-interest. Well, maybe in the model it looks so, but we know from anthropological studies that altruism is not derived from self-interest. It's a completely different pattern in human activities. We don't need people seeking some future payouts for them to act in an altruist manner. And then finally, and this is from my point of departure for the other part of this presentation, is that we see this really strong antagonism. And I liked what was being said in the end, that we have this open and cumulative science where the openness of the science allows more people to participate and the knowledge is cumulative. And then we have this like commercial side, which is mostly the rent-seeking for-profit technology, right? So accounts like Mansfield's in the paper from 40 years ago, they might be less relevant now. If we look at, for example, Philip Agyon's models, we see that we now have entered a very monopolistic stage of capitalism development. So actually that the technologies might mostly be about rent seeking and not really contributing to open science. And in the field of digital data, for example, we see that even though everybody knows that it's a common contributive resource, if I contribute to sharing data, I will get the aggregated new value of this data. But in the end, we have very low data sharing everywhere in the world. So we see that there is some space for regulation and institutions that will allow for this data sharing. So this antagonism led some researchers, especially in the economic regulation school and operized, so basically Marxists from the Italian tradition, to develop this kind of macroeconomic approach in mind. So also bear in mind, this will be macroeconomic and less related to science and then to general knowledge production. So I think this approach and the previous paper, they might to some extent speak to each other and we should find commonalities. Well, cognitive capitalism as an idea, it's not a mode of production. It doesn't tell us anything about technology setting, about division of labor, how we produce goods. It's not about that. It's rather about the production regime. So the institutional legal setting, dynamics of capital accumulation, and that impacts what is produced and what is valued. So also where the creation of value and where happens the extraction of value. And we also, in this thinking, we also reject endogenous growth models. So hot stepping here, although going into very different direction. It's mostly about accounting for social production of knowledge. So very often it's tacit knowledge. Very often it's the knowledge of social innovators who are in the citizen science movement or who contribute data, but they are not scientists by training. And they don't reside in formal hierarchies of science. And then also going beyond endogenous growth models means also accounting for the dynamics of labor versus capital, right? So the tensions, who produces, who captures value. This is very important. Looking at it as some kind as one system where everyone benefits from it, or like it's just scientists and then they also get value and they contribute back to the basic science. This kind of it's kind of ahistorical. We have the labor and capital dynamic that is present. People financing studies are not the same as the ones who do them. So the classic model of cognitive capitalism would be the one created by Fumagalli and Lucarelli. So it's first of all, it's a society level production of knowledge, as I mentioned. It looks at social productivity as well. So very often it's used to explain how value is created on social media, digital platforms, but also how non-scientists contribute to knowledge creation. How, for example, general level of education, like universal public services, contribute to a general level of knowledge, which allows everyone to use technology tools, for example. Second of all, it's embedded in history, so it's a strong Polanyian approach. But here, when I mention Polanyi, I mean Karl Polanyi, right? Michael Polanyi, for example. So it's a Polanyian approach in that we see how this model developed over time, that it used, for example, the globalization and weakening compromise between capital and labor, privatize welfare, use that to create technologies that can exploit codified knowledge, and that in turn this creates this dynamic. And mostly this model regards the last 50, 70 years. So definitely the development of the latest type of capitalism, it doesn't really explain the industrial revolution, or doesn't even try to do that. And here we can see that also this circle of cognitive capitalism is inherently unstable because it generates growth, right? So this is also the British example of industrial revolution. It's about growth, but also it bears conflict. This conflict may result in, it may result in wars, but also it may result in revolutions and other types of conflict. In terms of the macroeconomic model, just to explain it very briefly, on the supply side in the model, we have the network economies, which are just general knowledge intensity, but also we have learning economies. This is very important because they are positive with cumulative knowledge. So the more knowledge we add for everyone to use, the more there is, but we're not taking it as pure public good. It's more of residual knowledge that is created for everyone to use, but then it can be restricted on the other hand. So it's not a pure public good because it can be restricted with intellectual property rights. So the learning economies, they have both of these dynamics inside. And also on the supply side, it's complete detachment from the neoliberal and failed economics of savings equal investments. Not true in any sense, both theoretically and empirically. So here investments depend on expected demand, right? Aggregated demand, but also on the expected profit. So it's both about the growth, but also capturing a piece of the growth. And then the demand side, which is new for this kind of knowledge production regimes, is that part of capital gains also goes to high-skilled workers and shareholders. So the labor force is not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous. It has both low-skilled workers and high-skilled, which are also, they get some kind of packets of shares. And what is important, productivity growth negatively impacts employment, right? So also the wages are diminished. This is something that's, open for discussion. We actually see that the more automation we have in economy, usually the more employment we have. So I would argue with this side. But if we resolve the model, we have this inherent tension. First of all, the more intellectual property rights we have, the bigger we have profits, and from profits, more investments, because the VCs want to invest more. But the more intellectual property rights we have, it actually impacts learning economies and in the end network economies. So it's both a pro intellectual property rights, but then against as well. And then if we lower wages and increase profits, right? So we have more investment, but the more we lower wages, the more we diminish aggregate demand, and that impacts the future profits because we don't see the future demand for our products. So these tensions, this is a part of the old tensions of capitalism, but reimagined in this model. Well, it obviously leads to this idea that the production of knowledge is one thing, but then then value capture is a different thing. If we codify knowledge, right? So the codified knowledge is created by open science, but then tries to restrict this open science. And then profits arise from general social production of knowledge, of data, but these profits do not want to reproduce the social production. They want to escape and create new mechanisms of value capture. So basically, the prerequisites of this new form of accumulation are high R&D investments, strong social and human capital. Then private enterprises want to benefit while avoiding those costs and often pushing those costs to the public sector. And then what we also see in the latest development of this mode of knowledge production is that Actually, because under cognitive capitalism, the greatest return is not on wages and means of production, but on the very vehicles that can capture and extract value, right? So the intellectual property rights are the classic example, but we also have a new example of this kind of capturing of social reproduction. This is the digital platform model, right? And the biggest AI innovations coming from this data come from technology sector. And these technology platforms are still restricted by social reproduction. So this is the reproduction of our force, educating people, keeping them healthy, keeping their attention on a high level, etc. But they less rely on intellectual property rights, right? Because they build this infrastructure like natural monopolies of networks. So because they are the liquidity brokers, they don't have to rely on the IPRs that much. So getting rid of intellectual property rights, although it would seem like a good thing, I mean, it is a positive step, but it will not be enough to kind of stop this rent seeking of network, so basically tech companies. And the final slide to try to kind of bridge the kind of studies that myself and other scholars are doing in the critical studies of knowledge production. And this paper that we're discussing today, first of all, that we need more dynamic modeling rather than static. So would be great to see how this evolves over time. So for example, are some disciplines the winners of this race, and some disciplines probably like literature or art, they don't really see that much money flowing. That also means that we have to see science and knowledge not as homogeneous, but as heterogeneous goods. So they are produced differently in terms of these different disciplines. Would be great to see how we can link these micro foundations, the incentives, the creation of colleges with macroeconomic approach. So for example, a 2 or even 3 sector model where we have science, commercial technology, maybe even the public sector and the social, the general social society. And then it would be interesting to see how this capitalist antagonisms, how they result in very different effects that we now might, or in the past we have understudied. We regarded them as some kind of sociological or cultural, but they also come from actually the working of this knowledge production. So for example, the very problem of low trust in science coming from critique of, for example, big pharma, big tech, big agriculture leads to massive social harm, right? Like, for example, COVID-19 disinformation, being afraid, and the growing movement of anti-vaccine. This could be seen as an effect directly of this commercializing of science and then capture of science by big capitalist enterprises, which lead to people, people's growing disbelief in the products of science in general. So we could say that in the end, there is some kind of really massive social cost, and how this cost emerges, how it can be mitigated. This would be a really powerful contribution of regardless of the discipline from which we come, but it would be really great to see this kind of knowledge produced, because it would have really powerful policy impact. And in the end, I need to stress that as much as knowledge is not a pure public good, and it's not, and science is not as much, but then, for example, Mariana Mazzucato's research shows very well that without public funding of basic research, the commercial interest in it is really, really low. And even if it is, very often it's skewed in a private and for-profit interest. In big tech, it's very visible. I'm not sure about the other fields and other sectors because I'm not that much studied in them. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Janek. Okay, so would you, Professor Kealey, Professor Ricketts, answer to the to the some questions that or there's are there is someone also going to ask some other questions maybe?
Hi Renata, sorry, I'm just trying to find a place to unmute my microphone. No, sorry, how are you, Hanny? Would you want to open the discussion wider, or would you like me to say?
Yeah, I think we can. Yeah, we can now open. We can open now the Q&A session. So would you please answer to the thoughts that Janek Zygmuntowski presented, and then if there are some more questions, so we will.
Well, okay. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of many ideas presented by Jan. I mean, I think I can obviously only answer from the point of view of the sort of paper that Terance and I gave, and just pick up on some points that seem to be emphasized. One is science as treated as a kind of homogeneous good. I think this is an interesting criticism. I mean, actually, as in all theory, you have to make some judgments about what is the appropriate kind of level of generality to adopt. And certainly in our papers, we've taken it as not so much homogeneous, but anyway, we've dealt with science as a sort of an aggregate concept. On the other hand, it's perfectly reasonable to think in terms, as I think I may have just said, perhaps rather hurriedly in my presentation, in terms of a variety of colleges. In other words, you can break in terms of our type of approach, you can break things down into smaller areas, especially new areas where you'd expect along sort of Jason Potts lines about the commons, enthusiasts will, in particularly new areas, get together to learn about those areas, the potential for commercial development and so forth. And so just as in economics generally, I mean, you can talk about aggregate output, or you can talk about the output of industries, you can talk about the output of firms, you can talk about the output of a bubble gum. But you know, Marshall always, I always go back to Marshall because I had to read a lot of him as a student, I suppose. But you know, that was always a problem of working out exactly what level of, so to speak, what level of abstraction you were dealing with. But anyway, my point is that I quite agree that the contribution good approach could be looked at in terms of smaller areas. But just another important point I think that came across in terms of the weaknesses of our approach, that incentives might not just be commercial, that people might be interested in curiosity, reputation, all the rest of it. I absolutely accept that. And, you know, in fact, well, I certainly wouldn't want to be interpreted as somehow implying that the entire world was driven by just commercial incentives. But I don't think mere curiosity or the attempt to gain reputation could explain the Industrial Revolution. This is all I'm saying, because presumably, you know, these things were always important to mankind for millennia, and something had not quite been established to enable the takeoff to take place. You know, and you could argue about the situation, say, for example, in France, and the various royal academies and so forth that were set up, as Terance has pointed out in some of his historical work. I mean, these were often quite exclusive and so on. And you know, the more sort of royal approval you got, the more secrecy was involved. Whereas in England, you got the development of a entirely different sociology, and where openness was much more important. So anyway, all I'm saying, I suppose, is that I certainly wouldn't want, I don't suppose Terance would, to be interpreted as implying that actually profit generation was all that mattered. But the problem is that actually at the end of the day, our model is an economic model, and it has all the weaknesses of economic models. And I think that we do. I think it might be worth saying, by the way, that you know, we needed the commercial profits to drive this system. In order to give an incentive for people to you know, at the end of the day, we had to find, other than just curiosity, what would really be motivating. And as usual, if it's an economic model, you think, right, okay, there's a kind of serving of the consumer, and the potential profitability of all these new ideas is what's driving it. Now, it was perfectly reasonable to say that that kind of driving may not, in some normative sense, meet some societal needs that other people might find are important. And that's always going to be true. And I think that that is always going to be an explanation for science being funded to some extent elsewhere. You know, if you do think that atom bombs are important, then probably you're going to have to use the government to produce them rather than just rely on commercial development. You see what I mean? So and that is certainly true. But as I say, another point would be that when it comes to reputation and things like this, and the difference between pure and applied science, certainly we play down the distinction between pure and applied science on the grounds that pure science has advanced to a large extent by, in a sense, from feedback from applied results as much as the other way around. In other words, the linear model in which pure science produces then advances in technology and then in actual production of goods and applied results. I mean, that is the traditional linear model, and no doubt that happens to some degree. But equally, there are reverse. There are flows of information and so forth that work in the other direction. Practical problems are discovered or practical results are discovered just by trial and error, which then go and promote theoretical thoughts, you know, at the more abstract and pure scientific level. So we make less of the kind of pure and applied, basic and applied distinction than is usual. I have to say that. And in a paper that we produced recently for research policy, the role though of sort of prestige and that sort of thing did play quite a big part in looking at the balance between the public and the private sector in that paper. So in a sense, the model itself allows us to do that kind of work. But more than that, I think, well, the emphasis on institutional legal settings, I think, I'm very sympathetic with the importance of looking into all that. And although it doesn't come right out of the model, because as I said, in the end, our model is, for better or worse, an economic model. Nevertheless, it does draw attention to these legal institutional problems. I mean, that's the point. I mean, you have an area where there's no takeoff. I mean, how do we get to this takeoff point? So, okay, you're interested in how the institutions emerged, which led to that, you know, it seems to me that that a lot of the work that certainly Terance has done on the Industrial Revolution, although he can say more about this if he wants, is really about the particular sort of cultural, if you like, forces that led to particular institutions emerging, which then led to greater sharing and trust and so forth. Sort of Elinor Ostrom view of how things got going in the first place, if you like. But I have, I think there were so many ideas that were presented in Jan's presentation that I just jotted down those that I've responded to immediately. But I think I better stop there and let other people get enable other people to make some contributions, and maybe Terance wanted to come back on one or two points.
Shall I say a few things?
I think so, Terance, if you would.
Yeah, I should be brief because I think Martin has covered most of the points. Just a few points though to come out of Jan's point. First of all, the linear model is a myth. It was invented by lobbyists who wanted the government to tax innocent taxpayers, steal money from hardworking families, just so that scientists can have the luxury of playing in ivory towers with complete lack of concern for the general public. In fact, if you look at Adam Smith pointed this out, the linear model was a myth, because the linear model was first propagated by Francis Bacon in 1605. And Adam Smith pointed out it's just not true. What happens is you get this tremendous industrial production of R&D, out of which come advances in pure science. And as Mansfield has shown, to quote an author that you quoted, Mansfield showed that the more pure science a company does, the more profitable it becomes. Pure science is exceptionally profitable for industry, and there's absolutely no reason to worry about pure science being neglected by industry. As for Mariana Mazzucato, I mean, I'm sure she's a very nice person. I'm not making any criticism of her as a human being, but I find her scholarship absolutely without merit because she's dealing with fiction. She's dealing in a completely ahistorical world where she doesn't actually look at what happens to countries that governments don't fund science. She never considers crowding out. As Martin says, we just published a paper on crowding out. I would just dismiss that. Just as I dismiss, I'm afraid, the idea that mRNA vaccines depend on the government funding of science. It depends also on the government funding you're talking about. The lady in America who went in the end to work for BioNTech, who's the great scientist of mRNA, she just couldn't get grants from the NSF or the NIH, so she had to work for industry. So in fact, that's a government failure and industrial success, mRNA vaccines. It is true that DARPA did fund some of the Moderna work, and there's a huge difference between DARPA and the NSF. The NSF says there's market failure in science, therefore we have to compensate for that. DARPA is a completely different enterprise. DARPA says, look, we want to put a man on the moon, therefore that's a government policy, and therefore we will do this in support of government policies. And that's a completely different sort of science, and no one would ever stop. I mean, right from the very beginning of Britain and America, you get governments funding what's so-called mission science in purpose of the public good in terms of a particular mission, like putting a man on the moon. Nelson, as you pointed out, said that, you know, never would we put a man on the moon but for the American NASA. A classic example of complete waste of government money. Every single penny that NASA spent was a complete waste of money. Putting men on the moon was a trashy activity, very little function other than to compensate for some sort of psychosexual problem that John Kennedy was suffering from at the time. I will stop there, but I would say, Jan, I found your contribution very stimulating, but in as much as we disagree, I'm very happy to talk about disagreements further.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Kealey. And please feel free to ask further questions. Okay.
If there are no questions, can I take one more point?
Yeah, please.
If there are no questions, Jan was talking about anti-science and distrust of science. There's no distrust of science when it comes to iPhones. I mean, there are lots and lots of areas of science, but it is true. There are areas where science is distrusted, such as vaccines. And but vaccines aren't distrusted because people don't trust the companies. Vaccines are distrusted because people don't trust governments. And actually, I'm afraid there's a simple fact that a very large number of people are simply silly. Silliness is an endemic quality of the human race. Churchill was always complaining about the majority of British voters just being silly. And so, of course, you're going to get opposition to vaccines from people who are essentially silly. But where big tech produces things like iPhones that people love, you can't keep people away. And you needn't worry, in my opinion, about these companies carving out monopolies. These monopoly positions are all incredibly transient. And companies that even 10 years ago seemed dominant have now completely gone away. And Schumpeter got this absolutely right. Companies invest in R&D, create these monopoly or near monopoly positions, but they're immediately undermined by competitors. It's a completely healthy ecology, I would argue.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Can I offer a brief comment on basically? I think I will not repeat what Jan has said because I mostly agree with the points that I think show the strength of the paper, and to some degree I agree with what Jan identified as weaknesses. However, I think I would like to elaborate a little bit on how to perceive the knowledge as a contribution, or science as a contribution good from a little bit other perspective. I'm talking about Bruno Latour. I don't know if you heard of the guy Bruno Latour. He developed a concept of a laboratory. He is a sociologist offering a critical, laboring in critical tradition. And he was saying something in a Kuhnian way that science makes this kind of networks between scientists themselves. The nodes between the scientists are also very important, and the difference of the networks makes some fields of science different by themselves, even if the same scientists are collaborating with them. But also what he said, and what I think is very important, it's more. I think it's more relevant in the social and humanistic science and humanistic arts than in science per se. But what he said is important is the artifacts, the scientific artifacts that we make. And what he was saying is, it's actually, I think, similar to what you are saying, that these artifacts are not like beings which are without the merit. We are going into some kind of like interactions with them, changing them at the same time, but they are changing us as we are like trying to understand what these artifacts are all about. But what is important from the point of view of Latour, he was saying that what is the problem with this view of science is that it's becoming autopoietic in a classical sense, like the biologist will understand that it becomes like detached from the outside world, and what drives the incentives, because the incentives become very much internalized within the field of the science. And what is difficult with that is that it becomes a system of self-propriating like modes of knowledge production, which may become irrelevant from the outside world. So, for example, if we see enough like prestigious school of thought in a particular field, the network effects that it like encourages which are stronger in the bigger fields, yeah, in the bigger schools, can be thought of as being dangerous in the way that they discourage other scientists of forming critical thought for the school that is dominant in the field. It may be like the problem may be visible mostly probably in the social science. Well, heterodox economists are like victims of this, I think. But on the other hand, in natural science, this is also the case if the prevalent school of thought, for example, I don't know. Before Copernicus, you had this Ptolemaian thinking about the movement of the planets, and they were this view was so ingrained in the social fabric that it became the dominant view, which was institutionally defended by the powers that be, the Catholic Church at the time. And that's something that I want to contribute to the discussion, that what I took from the paper, one of the things that I took from the paper is that once the invisible college forms, it may become to some extent dangerous for other scientists who want to criticize what the invisible college is producing. If we take a heterogeneity of knowledge as a base, yeah, that's I'm sorry for being like too lengthy.
Martin, shall I take that? Okay, let me answer that. I basically agree with you. Of course, for those who don't know, Latour embedded himself in the lab, and he just sat there watching what people were doing and then wrote about it. It's a very interesting thing. I completely agree with you, actually, because what you're describing, in fact, is, well, there's an Arizona philosopher of science who makes the point, and let me quote the quote. He says, "It's technology that keeps science honest. It's technology that keeps science honest." And the trouble is that all this is government funded. The lab that Latour was embedded in was a government funded lab. And these are people who sit there writing grants to the government and taking money and doing with it what they want. There's no accountability apart from to fellow scientists. So there's this extremely unhealthy cesspool that government funding of science creates, exactly as you've described and as Latour was describing. And we see this in America today, particularly. There's this thing called the reproducibility crisis, which I'm sure you've heard of. Something like half of all scientific papers are false. I mean, it's the most extraordinary fact. Something like half of all scientific papers are palpably wrong. But the people who produce them continue to get rewarded with grants and promotion because the people who provide them with the grants and promotion also believe in the falsities. And so what we've had here, thanks to the government funding of science on an NSF model, market failure model, not the DARPA model, which is where you set a target, what we have here is an extremely unhealthy ecology where scientists are given money to reward scientists for confirming what they want to believe. And the only way out of that is to keep science firmly within the market so that scientists ultimately are connected to technology, because it's technology that keeps science honest. And you can say all you like in your scientific lab funded by the government that square wheels are the best wheels for a car. But if you're working for the Ford Motor Company and you produce square wheels, you'll very quickly be discredited. Your other point about the big man, to use sexist language, the big man who can control a scientific field and suppress others, you're again absolutely right. And there's a very interesting paper that was produced about 3 years ago, which showed that when the big man dies, I'm not trying to be sexist, it's just the term, when the big man dies prematurely, and this paper looked at about 1,300 cases of a big man dying prematurely, the field changed very dramatically after the death of this person. Many more young people came into the field and started generating very different results. So both your points about the dangers of science are 100% right. And in a sense, that's the consequence of it being a contribution good. But you don't make it worse by the government funding a very unhealthy ecosystem, because that makes it worse.
Okay, Are you waiting for some more questions? Okay, if not, Michał, so we will. Okay, Jan Zygmuntowski, please.
Yeah, I just want to have a quick go at two ideas which I think which come around here very often, and I think we have to find some kind of summary for them. One is that we should embed science within the market, and I think this line of thinking is outright dangerous. When we have top scientists in mathematics going for the market, they go to hedge funds and basically destroy the economy by inventing toxic schemes like collateralized debt obligations. When we have psychologists and behaviorists going for top funded positions, they go and create addictive apps on the smartphones. So basically the market incentives may be outright socially harmful, and like embedding science and embedding the truth, the pursuit of truth within profit schemes. These are just two logics which are wrong, and combining them is wrong. But at the same time, I completely agree with the critique of grant funding. I mean, if we create a system where you go on a project basis, these projects have their own KPIs, milestones, weird hierarchies of how you are supposed to pursue the truth. Now, instead of embedding everything within the profit motive, you have some kind of bureaucratic motive of the bureaucracy becoming a class in itself and for itself. But I see it as a logic of neoliberal approach to bureaucracy, as in, instead of just laying and doing your science, now you have to keep on proving your science has some merit. So you create fake science papers, you publish a lot, but without merit. And I think both market and purely grant scheme have the same problem. Nobody wants to do peer review. Why would you do peer review? There is no market incentive for peer reviews, and there is no public incentive for peer reviews, so nobody does them. And in the end, I think we can all agree on the mission-oriented approach. So this kind of getting together the market, or showing the market the way, instead of just correcting for market failures, for providing the public critiques and public direction of this mission. I think that us talking about it is the greatest contribution of Mariana Mazzucato to the scholarly field, because this is the core of her thinking. So it already had an impact because we're saying it.
Can I just respond to that to say that I agree with you. The market is not perfect. There's no question about that. The market is absolutely not perfect. And if you were to say to me that there's a role for government to fund scientists for the sole purpose of providing knowledge to challenge the market, like, for example, cigarette companies and tobacco, I would agree with you, at least in theory. The problem with that, by the way, I'm actually agreeing with you, but the problem with that in practice is that, in fact, if you look at how the market, in fact, because there is a thing called the actuarial professions and actuaries. Actuaries a long time ago were beginning to work out that blood pressure was bad for you and smoking was bad for you. And so it's very hard to show actually examples of the government funding of science actually successfully challenging the market and proving it to be wrong. However, if you're going to tell me the market is imperfect and that somehow perhaps a stream of government funding for science would create a plurality of knowledge, I could not show you to be wrong. But where you support Mariana Mazzucato, I have to draw the line there, but perhaps this is not the appropriate forum for that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll be approaching to the end of our meeting today. If there are no more questions, I cannot see. Okay, so I'd like to thank our distinguished speakers, Professor Ricketts, Professor Kealey, for making this excellent presentation and making the seminar very meaningful and interesting. And thank you for your thought-provoking and interesting address. And I'd also like to express my deep gratitude to the discussant, Jan Zygmuntowski, for his contribution. Thank you very much.